I'm Justin, and I'm a gay Christian. In the LGBT Scriptural Debate, there are two main streams of thought, so side B and side A. So side B is non-affirming. It's the traditional interpretation of Scripture that forbids all same-sex behavior, period. And side A, which is affirming and argues that the biblical judgments against same-sex behavior does not apply to same-sex relationships today because they don't address the same issues involved. This discussion is based primarily on the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis and the 6 so-called clobber passages, so 3 of which are in the Old Testament and 3 of which are in the New Testament. Side B argues that in Genesis, God created Adam and Eve, and through their union, implicitly laid out a prescriptive heterosexual vision for marriage through complementarity. In Genesis 19, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, a few angels stay at Lot's home. During that time, the townspeople surround his home and demand that Lot bring out his guests so that they can have sex with them. God then decides to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. And this is thought to be because of their homosexual desires. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is actually pretty easy to tease out because non-affirming and affirming scholars can agree that this story actually has nothing to do with the queer scriptural debate. When the townspeople are demanding that Lot bring out his guests to have sex with them, this is actually a form of intended gang rape, where the men are using sex as a tactic to exert their dominance and aggression on these foreign guests. All right, so the Bible clearly speaks of same-sex behavior in a very negative light, but to better understand where the Bible is coming from, we really have to read these texts in the context of its time. So note, the Bible was written by many different males over a span of many centuries in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, and put together by males and edited by males in what was a very patriarchal, honor-shame society. We can see this patriarchy in the way they perceive gender roles and sex. So males were associated with being powerful, dominant, self-controlled, and females weak, irrational, self-indulgent, overly excessive. So back in Greco-Roman times, sex was not viewed in terms of sexual orientation, but instead in terms of active and passive roles in sex. It was culturally acceptable for a male to have sex with anybody else, male or female, as long as they were of lower social status. So we do see same-sex behavior during biblical times, but this is only in the form of prostitution, pederasty between male and boy, and between master and slave. Same-sex behavior was perceived as a result of excess lust, where perhaps if you were not satisfied with sex with your wife, you would go out and find other means of sexual release. An equal status male-to-male relationship, however, was not acceptable because one of the males would have to play the passive roles, and this was threatening male dominance and breaking the gender hierarchy. So with this understanding, this clarifies immensely our interpretation of Scripture. So let's take a look at side A. Second and third clobber passages, Leviticus 19:22 and Leviticus 20:13. For a man to lie with a man is an abomination. If a man has sexual relations with a man, as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. So this prohibition is part of the Old Testament's holiness codes. So during this time, the Israelites were given very strict rituals as reminders that they were distinct, chosen people of God, as opposed to the other ethnic groups in the area. When the Bible speaks of an abomination or towiva, this is actually in association with culturally foreign practices and pagan practices. So many of these practices include not mixing 2 cloths together or not eating shellfish, practices that we don't practice today. So the New Testament actually teaches that Jesus' death and resurrection fulfilled that law, so which is why those regulations don't apply to New Testament Christians or Christians today. So 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. Neither the sexually immoral nor men who have sex with men will inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Timothy 1:10. We also know that the law is not made for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality. So for these two verses, we have to return to the original translation of homosexuals. So the term homosexual actually wasn't termed in English until 1892. So note when the word homosexual was used in the Bible, that coincidentally fell into the time of the American AIDS crisis when scripture was used to condemn homosexuality and perpetuate homophobia. The original Hellenistic Greek term that was translated to homosexuals was malakoi and arsenokoitai. So malakoi is a broad term referring to anything that was effeminate. So as we had discussed before, self-indulgent, overly excessive, and arsenokoitai, when we view this term in the context of other secular texts, is referring to some kind of exploitation by means of sex. So when we put these two terms together, they make sense in the cultural context of same-sex behavior. And finally, Romans 1:26 through 27. Even though women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, in the same way the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. In this verse, the words Paul uses to describe same-sex behavior include words like lust, passion, and burning. So again, these words fall in line with our cultural understanding of same-sex behavior. So remember, same-sex behavior was viewed as an excess of lust and out of control type of passion. Paul's overall message here, when he's referring to the nature of same-sex behavior, it's self-seeking, and thus it's very idolatrous. Essentially, the 6 clobber passages discuss same-sex behavior in a way that we wouldn't even accept today. Same-sex committed monogamous relationships aren't discussed in the Bible because they just didn't exist in the time. Now, this begs the question, can same-sex relationships be included in the definition of marriage? Like we had discussed before, non-affirming scholars base the institution of marriage on the idea of anatomical complementarity. Truth is, this idea is never discussed anywhere in the Bible. So the focus of Genesis isn't on the complementarity of Adam and Eve, but instead on their companionship or similarity over the animal kingdom. Adam and Eve's one flesh union is a type of kinship bond. So a type of bond where there shouldn't be any question as to whether or not same-sex couples are capable of. So in summary, I am a gay Christian and we do exist. If you happen to be interested in a more in-depth analysis of the 6 clobber passages, go ahead and click the link below.
You feel good?
I do.
Good.